So this is my reflection commentary on chapter 28 of the Proverbs. I finished last time with verse 14, and we're going to continue now with verse 15. As a roaring lion and a raging bear, so is a wicked ruler over the poor people. So I wonder if I should give a bit of an introduction to this episode, at the very least to warm my mind up to experience something from these Proverbs. I find myself often reflecting on my behavior, as one does when they explore these sorts of things, about the way that I am, the way that I choose to be, how this reflects off of me and into the broader environment, how it influences my relationships, how it influences my thoughts. And I think also, although in tricky territory, as one doesn't want to assume a position that they ought not to, as in the position of a judge, but I have observed a type of behavior, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a type of person, but I think in extreme cases it can be. A type of behavior in which this selfish desire, selfish disposition, selfish orientation reflects something awful into the environment, into the observing world. And how subtle these things can be, and on the other hand, how explicit they can be. I was having a conversation with somebody today about a coworker of this person, not of mine. And the general reflection on the part of this person was that this individual, this coworker, wished to control speech, emotion, the general direction that the mind thinks. And as a secondary note, not as a consequence to this conversation, but almost as a parallel, there's a particular coworker of mine that I've wondered about. Again, I've wondered about this disposition. I've wondered about this way of being, way of acting. And again, I try not to judge too harshly. Of course, we have to make judgments to come to conclusions about things, but in my better moments, I try to use it as a reflection on my own behavior. I wonder if there are elements of my expression that mimic or are similar to my coworker. Now, I understand this is a bit cryptic here, and that I made the distinction that I think it's rare that a person occupies that wicked tyrannical territory completely. I think some people occupy it more than others. I guess my coworker, I don't think this person occupies it all that much, but there is a general trend or thread that is observable. It is somewhat common. But among other good qualities and characteristics as well. And so I say this to say that as we move through this verse, I want to be thinking about this disposition, that fundamental orientation, as it involves matters of the self, and how one's intrinsic beliefs, the beliefs that we just sort of have before we go in there and start tinkering with them, how these beliefs affect our behavior. And perhaps the broader environment for which these beliefs find themselves to exist or to rest within our mind. As a roaring lion and a raging bear. Now, at the risk of being a bit tedious, I want to explore this just a little bit. With regard to the first, as a roaring lion, it is not likely that a lion would be roaring in the middle of a fight. And so this dramatic experience of the lion, I don't think we ought to be considering. But it's more so, as we might find in a zoo or in a documentary on the plain, in which the lion is roaring into the environment. Why it is doing so, I suppose it's difficult to explain on certain levels. In others, we can find some reasonable explanation. Animals are so interesting because of their relative consciousness to ours, their experience, their agency. And so when a lion roars into the open plain, perhaps it sees another animal, perhaps it does not. If it does not, the question is, well, what compels it to do so? Some inner drive. But surely there is a purpose. And although we may not attribute to an animal a type of purposeful behavior that we do to the human being, it's still purposeful nonetheless, regardless of that level of experience. And of course it has a general effect in the world, and among those creatures that might hear it. The roar of a lion is powerful. I believe it could be heard up to 5 miles away. It is an expression of presence and of strength, of challenge. And the raging bear, I think of this powerful animal that is looking for prey. It is scanning the environment, looking for something that it can subdue. And so in this way, when we approach this wicked ruler over the poor people, we find a person that is wishing to make his presence known, that believes of himself a particular way as the lion feels of himself, that he is driven to express this position of authority, to claim it for himself, to make all who are in the immediate vicinity aware of his desire. And he is compelled, like this raging bear, to scan that surrounding environment and to find anything that he can, again, subdue, to find any weakness that he can manipulate. So this wicked ruler, as I mentioned, I want to try to talk a little bit about where exactly in mind we might find a disposition such as this. And I'd like to say that among previous explorations about the fool, especially in chapter 26, there is an idea that in every one of us there exists these patterns. There probably exists a degree of wickedness, foolishness. But it's a matter of faith and discipline that we search these things out and put them in their proper place. And so it ought not to be difficult to understand what the wicked person is, what they can be, given the smallest amount of it that we may find in ourselves. In many instances, I've referred to this wicked person as somebody that is quite selfish. And that there's something about this malalignment of self to environment, of self to information in general, that leads to what we would call wickedness. And by this I mean, when we take any system and we wish it to exist in a vacuum, I think what we find is that system is unable to continue. It always requires some inputs from outside of it. It requires some relationships to sustain it. If it can do so, it can only do so temporarily. I may survive in a cage without access to food and water, but eventually I would perish in that environment. A cell may survive for a period without nutrients, but given the lack of necessities, the cell will die. And I think the self is similar to that. We are all bound in this interrelated network, both culturally, economically, but also experientially. Perhaps, maybe not most important, but surely important, is that our physical bodies may not survive if we do not have the proper relationship to the environment. And so, for the wicked person, I think it's a matter of the way in which they organize information, the way that they relate to information. And while the wicked person is not somebody that is an agent in a vacuum, because I believe that this cannot exist, the wicked person is approaching that experience. They have this desire to be closed off, to fulfill their innermost desire at the expense of others, without any consideration, without that harmony that we would so expect to find within a good person or a righteous person. I think about the guitar in this line of thinking, because it's quite easy, especially among a novice, to find a few notes that do not resonate well with each other. But a chord is an interesting structure, a series of different notes that come together to form a chord that has a particular key, but has a particular harmony. The notes resonate with each other. has a particular way of sounding. It produces a way of feeling in us. And in this way that we recognize a chord or something that is agreeable, certain elements are brought together that agree with our intuition. I think in this way we can come across individuals, both of our own experience but also of others, in which we are able to tell to some degree. Not everything can be placed on intuition, of course, but there are plenty of instances in which the way in which we experience tells us a lot about a person without even having to say much about the way that they carry themselves, their attention, their body language. But perhaps some of this is getting off track. I have this desire to explore that disposition of the wicked. How we experience the wicked, or how we pick up on a wicked person in the environment is interesting, I suppose, but understanding it on a personal level, an experiential level, I think opens up the definition of what that wicked person is. Now, within my own experience, there is no secret. I'm quite open about the fact that there are periods in my conscious experience where, for whatever reason, by desire or just by pure weakness and laziness, my mind goes to something quite superficial. It tends towards absence and a bit of a lethargy. And it takes a considerable amount of effort in order to keep the engine running, so to speak, and to be focused on something, to be productive. Now, wickedness is, I think, a particular type of willful experience, in the sense that it may not necessarily be that the wicked person tends towards this state of mind that is absent or lazy. They may be quite productive in their attentive qualities. They may be quite disciplined. But I think the effects, their behavior in the world is often geared towards reducing others to such a state, to such an extremity of that lethargy, of that subdued character, such that they are not the principal actors in a particular situation, or whatever. And when we think about this class of person, the subject, the person that is subject to the wicked ruler, the poor person, the person that is without, generally speaking, I think the people that are without are generally looking to be supplied with something. And here I wish to avoid that exploration of the material something, because that's a given. But poverty extends much deeper than just the material level. And given this absence of maybe of experience, of mind, of way of orienting to things, the wicked person finds themselves in a semi-elevated state relative to the poor person. They're able to give them a sense of the glory of the intelligible world, of more specifically the mind domain, or give the mind the perception that it may be elevated to a certain place if they follow the wicked ruler, or because they think that the wicked ruler is the light that they ought to submit to. They worship the ruler like a god, an emperor. But these poor people, part of what makes them bound to this distinction and to this class is that they do not possess that agency for which they are able to reduce their situation out of, or rise above a particular situation, maybe I should say. And it really doesn't have anything to do with this material prosperity. Some of that is important, surely. A base level of subsistence is quite fundamental, because it competes for that very survival. Existence at that level, at that scale, is not as it is for those who are born in relative affluence, whose concerns are more geared towards the conscious experience, the conscious purposeful experience. When the concerns are immediate, in which the body may perish, and it's a day-to-day struggle, certainly the mind is quite preoccupied. And given the immense resources that are required to satisfy such a way of life, it is quite easy that some usurper of agency will come along and take a share from each person, from each poor person, such that they are afforded this opportunity to experience the conscious dilemma, that existential experience, conscious experience. And for the poor person, as I've mentioned, the capacity, while it is there, everybody has that capacity for transformation, it is severely diminished, it is chained by that wicked ruler. And so the roaring lion is somebody that exclaims their presence and their desire forcefully, while all the while looking for that weak point to submit somebody to their will. The prince that wants understanding is also a great oppressor. But he that hates covetousness shall prolong his days. Now there's one thing that I'd like to say before getting into this verse. It has to do with the previous. I had mentioned that I want to get into that internal wicked disposition, however small or however large it happens to be within us. I touched on it here and there, but this is something that I think we'll have to return to. And within the remaining chapters, there is no doubt that the word wicked will come up again, and we will exercise it then. So how do we square this now? The prince that wants understanding is also a great oppressor. So we understand that the wicked person that rules over the poor has this violent and exploitative temper. But it's much harder now, I think, to examine a situation in which there is somebody that wishes to rule, somebody that wishes to take on a particular level of responsibility, and desires to know, desires to understand something. Surely, in all of our leaders, we would wish to have somebody that would actually want to understand rather than just be in that position because of its benefits, because of the power. But there's another way in which we have to think about this, that obviously that pursuit of understanding affords some danger. Now let's speak about this word understanding for a moment. We have gone through this exercise a few times. I've taken a quite literal interpretation to the word understand, using the word under and stand, and making some mental model about that word. There's another way that we can approach it from the Old English origins, meaning or the idea of standing in the midst of something. That prefix under, not necessarily just applying or referring to beneath, but also among, between, or in the presence of. And of course, stand is consistent with what we would expect, just to stand like an upright posture. And so when we consider ourselves, we begin to daydream for a moment. We think of ourselves standing in the midst of something. The question naturally arises, well, what exactly does it mean for us to stand in the midst of something? We can think about it physically. I could be standing in the midst of an intersection. I could be standing in the midst of my room. I could be standing in the midst of my workplace or an office, whatever. But all of these things imply not just a location, but also some purpose. That if I am standing in the midst of my room, I'm in a particular location, but this location has a particular structure, a particular purpose to it. I likely have a purpose for being there. We can extend this out, and we could say that we are standing in the midst of goodness, of greatness, of concern, of opposition. We are standing in the midst of chaos. We are standing in the midst of an exciting event. These sorts of things, unlike the physical, provide us with a broader map for that cognitive experience. So if I am standing within the presence of something, I am within that thing. I am participating to some degree with the essence of it, I suppose I can say. Now, what do I mean by that exactly? Well, let's take where I am now. I'm sitting, but whatever. I'm sitting within this room. There's a way in which I'm participating in this room. I'm using the various features. I am occupying it. These are quite basic patterns, of course. But they are all a form of understanding. I'm sitting at a chair. I'm talking into the microphone. I'm reading the Bible. I'm using some software application to record my voice. All of these little bits of information, outside of just me participating with this room in this environment, each one of these, there's an aspect of it that I am standing in the presence of. I am participating with the purpose of this microphone, the purpose of the Bible, the purpose of this counter, the purpose of the laptop. And so understanding, I think, not only, well, I'll say this, understanding, I think, fundamentally has to do with the way in which we participate with something, the way in which we recognize the purpose of something, and then interact with it. Now, of course, there are various levels of interaction. I can go through these verses quite superficially, not remember hardly any of it, or go through it as I try to go through it and reflect on it, and perhaps go through it in such detail that it's hard to remember anyway. But the point is that there are levels to understanding, much like there are, again, to use another example, there are levels to understanding the usage of this microphone. Now, there may be only a set numbers of ways that I can participate with it, but understanding it at a more intimate level, I think, may afford and open up different ways of relating, and thereby ways of seeing, ways of comprehending. The prince that wants understanding is also a great oppressor. So when we think about the word understanding now, there's nothing inherent within it that would suggest that my participation with this microphone is oppressive. there is something within the desire of the prince that can turn contrary. I think this is the fundamental focus for the first half of this verse. Is how exactly can such a fundamental thing as understanding, the very way in which we relate to objects and to other living things, how can this lead to oppression? The answer lies within the heart, for it is the producer of our desires. Such a complex thing, our feelings. I mentioned intuition not long ago, how intimately tied to the heart this is. Of course, our reason, our rational mind, is another aspect of mind that we possess. It is one of the fundamental components of our existence, of our being, rather. But our feelings, at least from my standpoint, are fascinating. They come to us in vibrant colors. They provide us insights, but they can also deceive us. And I think it is within their deception that we find our first inclination, first possibility that a prince can fall from a state of desiring understanding in a righteous manner to a way in which they desire understanding in a destructive and controlling manner. And so what of this desire? Now, what I find interesting about feeling is that it can be destructive about almost anything if we let it go, if we let it just freely occupy. It becomes an explorer that explores crevices that are potentially dangerous, that we could fall into, that we cannot be able to find ourselves out of. The desire for understanding may be natural. The way in which we orient to the world, for the most part, is natural. It is something that we must do. We must undergo that process of understanding in order to survive, in order to communicate with others, in order to participate with material things. Now we could say that participation with others, participation with material things, can find itself in such a way that we wish to use these things, as we had mentioned earlier in the previous verse, that the wicked, of the wicked ruler over the poor. But there's a way in which this is not necessarily in parallel with this verse. It's certainly related. But I think the true point of this verse, of the first part of it, is to stress the point that although understanding is fundamental, it's something that we all exercise, there's a way in which we can orient ourselves to the concept of understanding and the potential therein. So the sort of the thinking about thinking aspect, the meta concern, the meta drive, such that we consider understanding to such degree that it no longer becomes understanding. We become divorced from that way of participating, of seamless participation. And since we become so divorced with it, we are no longer these harmonic structures. We are no longer notes that agree with an accord, but rather some disharmonious note among various others that may be in harmony, may be not, who knows. And this is more of a parallel to, or an analogy to that the society that this prince is to rule over, or is currently ruling over. So let's think about a particular example then. Let's say I am at work, and I have a particular occupation for which I need to have some ability to observe a number of variables, to test for variables, to organize them in such a way and give some conclusion about the origin of something. Now, if my thought process is so divorced from being in presence with something, such that I am outside of it, since I'm using the word, I'll use out, or away from. There's no way that I would be able to actually understand something if what I am constantly thinking about is understanding for the sake of understanding. Thinking about being in the presence of, or being in line with that truth, rather than actually pursuing the truth. The two might seem related, and it might not seem like I'm saying anything particularly different, but in these personal experiences for which I'm in the process of identifying and tracing something to some principled cause, if I am primarily concerned with a cookie-cutter approach to solving that issue, or a series of issues, moreover than just a cookie-cutter approach, taking an approach to solving a problem for which I am thinking about the way in which either I was taught to solve the problem, or maybe I'm, as I've mentioned, the cookie cutter example, so following some checklist, or thinking about something that I had read that was common, associating it with another set of circumstances, which in and of itself is not necessarily bad, but to the degree that I ignore the present findings, that I spend my time in places other than the true identification of fundamental observations, like certain qualities of presence, certain qualities of a material, some object at some point in time. If I'm away from that present moment, I'm not in the presence of these fundamental factors, but objected. I'm outside. There's something about my experience that will be lessened, I think. There's something about my participation that will blind me to the purpose of something. And so although I think that understanding is a fine line, that sometimes, oftentimes, even in quite seasoned individuals. The process of understanding is something that constantly unfolds. It is something that we constantly make mistakes about. It's a balance that can tilt too far in one direction or another, and we may not get it right in one particular context and may be better at it in another. With regard to what we see here about the oppressor, the prince that wants understanding is also a great oppressor. I think at least part of it must do with this this approach to understanding the purpose of things and not being able to recognize their place in that approach. I have one more example in my mind. I think about education. I think about my experience going through higher education, the process of becoming educated. There are plenty of things within it that are good and useful, but there are plenty of things within it that, as I reflect on it now, are probably antagonistic to learning. And I think it has to, a degree of this has to do with the word oppression, prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control. And I say this in the context of understanding fundamental principles. In my profession, I deal with health. I deal with the body. The fundamentals of the body are fairly straightforward. But there are plenty of things that lie on top of this that get in the way, I think, of fruitful understanding, of individual blossoming, the unfolding of the flower of understanding. There are plenty of institutional constraints that are given to us, maybe provided to us, to perpetuate a particular way of things. It may get us more money. It may provide us with some certification that gives us some perceived greater position of authority. But all the while, it gets us farther and farther away from those principles. It's unjust in that regard. It gets us farther away from the truth. And while we may be pursuing understanding to know more, what in fact we are actually doing is this sort of pseudo progress into some disjointed, malaligned cultural apparatus or institutional apparatus that wishes us to believe that we are pursuing something for our own good, while there may be elements of it in there that we do actually learn more, but for the most part, we are engaging in some process that is entirely destructive and fake, false. There's a false face to it. The prince that wants understanding is also a great oppressor. But he that hates covetousness shall prolong his days. So today is a new day. A new day, new thoughts. So today is a Thursday, on the eve of a Friday. So I'd like to begin by talking about this word, covetousness, or to covet something. And so as usual, I'll follow our etymological chain. So beginning with Middle English, the term covetousness emerged around the 13th to 14th century. The meaning of which was eager, an excessive desire, greed, or avarice. And it's derived from the word covetous, which meant having an inordinate desire for something, especially what belongs to another. From the Old French, we have a word meaning something similar: desirous, eager, longing, yearning. From Latin roots, we have the word cupiditas, meaning desire, longing, eagerness, or ambition. So all quite similar in terms of their meaning. And how interesting it is how many words that are used, fundamental words that are used in the Proverbs that involve desire, involve a particular orientation of desire. Now, to covet, I would like to retain this element of longing, desire, aspect of greed, but also the idea, which I guess would come into longing, but the idea more specifically of wishing to have something of another, to have something that's somebody else has. But he that hates covetousness shall prolong his days. Immediately understandable, I suppose, that anything in excess can cause us to go astray, can cause us to partake in behaviors that are counterproductive, that don't lead us to ends that are fulfilling, meaningful. But of course, this is the proverb. This is our opportunity to explore and to imagine something a little bit more sophisticated. Now, if we imagine the word hate, we again find ourselves in the territory of the heart. I've explored this word in depth. I've come to some structure by which I can understand what the word means. A rather convoluted definition, perhaps, but to put it simply, to begin with, it's an intense feeling, a passionate dislike for something or someone, a loathsomeness, despising. And I've talked about this before in the context of the heart, but in the sense that the heart does not necessarily produce anger in and of itself. If we imagine the heart as this industrial machine that is producing base emotions, but all the same, it has a little bit more of a sophisticated structure, ontology, maybe we could say. But the heart itself is a substructure of the conscious experience. But what I mean by that anger is not necessarily a product of the heart is that the elements that are produced by the heart, I think, produce the fundamental components that evolve into something that is anger. Because anger and hate, these are intense emotions. But there is this reason behind it. Usually we don't hate arbitrarily. Now, we can have a lot of dissatisfaction in our life, and I think that can result in a lot of negative emotion being produced. But if we consider some reason behind our hate, it is the rational aspect of mind that is wed to some more basic intensity. And it is the union of these two that brings about this hate. And so the object of my concern here is, well, why exactly do we hate, or should we hate, covetousness? As I mentioned, there's something quite straightforward about why this can be potentially negative. But again, for the sake of our memory, there must be a richer exploration here. So I want to consider desire, longing, just for a moment. We'll progress to some of the other parts of this word as we move into it. But from my experience, desire and longing have always been something of a torturous device for me. I think that there are plenty of ways in which somebody can desire something. There are plenty of ways in which somebody can long for something or someone else. There are ways in which this intensity of desire can be positive, but also quite negative. And I've experienced both. I think the disposition in general of having strong desire would expose us both to the positive but also the negative. And it's the wrestling of the negative that we find covetousness from a personal or subjective standpoint. For of desire, we can say that it is a feeling. There's an element of wanting. Of wanting, we can say that there is a direction of the subject. It is drawn towards something. There is a pull from somewhere on it that directs or orients its attention. Usually the fundamental or bedrock of what we consider is where the attention goes. I think of the expression, follow the money, and how much truth is revealed when one does so. In a like manner, we can say follow the attention. We can say follow the heart, and we will find where a person's true intention rests. But at what point does it necessarily become sinful, this desire, this wanting, this longing? What exactly is it that we are transgressing? What is the boundary? What does it look like? How is it experienced? I suppose it's easy to say that there are multiple things that can contribute to transgression. There are multiple things that can point to an unhealthy desire or an unhealthy longing. But this balance and this harmony, much like learning to play an instrument, I think is difficult. We may be able to find a couple notes that sound well together, but of the broader possibility of the ways that we can put different sounds together and produce something quite beautiful, starting from such a place of adolescence, I think can seem a bit daunting. But what is exciting is that beauty that is on the horizon, from understanding something about our experience, about understanding or at least trying to reflect on something that is so common among all people, that capacity and the quite likely potential that somebody will fall into this trap of excessive desire. So let's begin with desire itself. What can we say of it before it reaches this crossroad, before it becomes positive or before it becomes negative? We have to find ourselves in quite a fundamental headspace, I suppose. Thinking about wanting, thinking about being attracted or drawn to something. In a fundamental sense, we can take the body's yearnings or longing. I think of the experience about having to go to the bathroom. This is something that I listen to. It is something that eventually has to happen, but just because I am prompted by it doesn't mean I necessarily have to take care of that business. I could think about other bodily desires like thirst and of hunger. Right now, I could quite easily reach down and grab my water bottle and get a drink. And it is not as though this desire that I have right now is excessive. It is something that my body needs to survive. I have no particular reason to pick up my water bottle and to let the volume of water flow to such a rate that would cause me to choke. That would seem to me to be counterproductive. But perhaps therein lies our first boundary or transgression. While it may not be necessarily simple in all situations, that just because we identify that transgression, violation of purpose when it comes to drinking water, and let me lay this out explicitly before I move on. What I mean by this, the point at which the desire, now maybe I should even wind back farther. I mentioned that I wanted to start at the point before the positive or the negative. And I may have to come back to this. But when I think about the example of water, or of wanting a drink of water, when the desire itself comes, it's likely a prompting because there is some need somewhere in the system for more water. And so this desire in that sense is positive because it fulfills some existential purpose. I would not necessarily want to restrict all longings and desires to some existential purpose, but it is, in my mind, quite an important aspect of this. So I'll continue here. Maybe I'll go back to that fundamental place of desire. So in terms of the water analogy, if I am not thirsty, I can certainly have the thought of drinking water. I can convince myself that there is some utility. I can light the fire under some desire. I've had this situation when I'm preparing to go to the gym to work out. I need to be hydrated. Throughout my working day, there are limited chances for which I can drink water. And so I have to be smart about when I drink water. I have to plan it and execute. And I have to drink enough of it such that I'm ready to go. And I also have to be aware of how much I might have to be going to the bathroom, which will also take time during the workday. And so there is this, in the physical sense, the desire really isn't there to drink water, but there is some secondary purpose for which I recognize the reason, given some future circumstance, that I will have to partake in a particular wanting. Now in this way, of course, just because on the more basic level, my body is not telling the brain that I need water. It's more the brain telling itself that the body needs water to function well in the future. This is still a good thing. And I should say that in the base instance in which the body is desiring water, it is a good thing. It is a good thing because there is a true need. The true need is, again, at some level existential. Not that because I am thirsty, I will die, but because I am thirsty, there is an indication of need. And the need, extended out long enough, would eventually find itself in a place of suffering to such a degree that the body would perish because of it. And all of the graduated levels in between that. And so at the base level, it is quite existential. It is survival. So today is a new day. I'm excited to get back into this verse. But I think I might take a departure from that last thought. It was getting a little convoluted, and I'm afraid off the mark. There are elements of it that I'll continue with for sure. I want to stay on the point of talking about longing, desire, talking about that boundary, the point at which we cross a healthy desire, or something that is good, to something that is unhealthy, something that can approach covetousness. And much like previous conversations about the word pride, I think, or pride and conceit more specifically, I think the road progresses gradually, but there is some point at which we do make the distinction, because we don't just always say that pride is satisfaction. We don't just say that conceit is satisfaction with one's achievements. It's the degree to which we observe this thing to happen, for which we are engaged too heavily within the self, such that we, who knows what the consequences are. Perhaps behaviorally we're unable to connect to people. Maybe we are seen by others as selfish, arrogant. And much like this, the covetousness, there must be a point, there has to be a point at which desire, longing, becomes excessive. And although laying down an exact structure to delineate when that desire becomes excessive is going to be difficult and perhaps impossible to a degree, I think we can approach it. We can approach this general area. We can put boundaries around it. Well, even though at the immediate boundary we may not find covetousness, we ought to make sure that where we set it is somewhat before the actual distinction, so we can avoid it. So to return to covetousness, something that is strong, often sinful, desire for wealth, possessions, another's belongings. The habits of another, the job of another, the wife of another. There are many things that we can covet. So I started that journey of trying to outline things that are good. And I found myself in that territory of the fundamental, or the fundament. for which we all require a certain level of nutrition, of sustenance to survive, for the body to survive. And that type of desire we find many times at that level. We are not approaching covetousness. We are not approaching greed. Or gluttony. Now I wonder, as we're exploring this word covetousness, I wonder at the Hebrew word that was used in the Proverbs. Now the word betzah in Hebrew, the root meaning is gain, profit, unjust gain, plunder, greed. Covetousness is often translated in English from that word. And so I find an interesting reflection here that in this translation we have more of the foundation or the beginning of that flow of information from the mind. Because to covet, it begins in the mind. It begins with the observation of somebody else's material possessions and then having this sense of profound desire and longing to have what somebody else has. But in this word betzah, we have a situation in which some action is already unfolded. The process by which this covetousness would naturally flow into the taking, the unjust gain, the idea of greed and not wishing to procure something under just means, but rather to keep and take for themselves. All of this follows, of course, but all the same, I find it interesting. And I still find myself pondering at what point do we find this covetousness to spring forth into being, into true meaning. And in my mind, I find this dramatic unfolding for which the perceptive mind, the mind that wishes to know, unlike the mind of the prince in the previous half of this verse, subject to that lack of understanding, the perpetual wanting, perhaps even of itself, the covetousness of a sort. But unfortunately, I think the subtlety of our experience obscures this boundary. And I know I keep dancing around it because I'm desperately trying to find that point or some principle that would guide me in. But thinking about my own situation, thinking about the things that I desire, perhaps that people close to me possess, I can ask myself the question, well, my friend has, for example, for today, my friend bought a new car. He traded in his old one and he bought a new one. It happens to be quite an expensive car, a luxury car. And I am thankful that I did not have this covetous disposition towards this possession. However, I can easily imagine that by the qualities that are attractive, that are seductive, perhaps, about this possession, this object, like all of the gadgets that come with modern luxury cars, the sophistication of its appearance, the aesthetic, the horsepower, there are plenty of different elements that we can pile together in this cup of potential desire of various qualities. But at what point does it become poison rather than just some interesting conversation piece? Certainly, I would imagine that this would become problematic if I were to look to my friend and say, or to feel in my heart, a sense of jealousy, but again, consistent with this definition, a profound desire and longing to have that object, to have that possession. And the question being, well, now, what would it interfere with? I think obviously it would interfere with our relationship. It would interfere, at the very least, with the interaction at that moment. The thoughts that would come in would be born of an adverse feeling, in the way that because something is bound or something is related to my friend more intimately than it is to me, that again breeds this jealousy, a type of envy, feelings of discontent, indignation, bitterness. And at this point, as we imagine this landscape of relationality, that of different nodes in the network, of information in general as it relates to each other, and of particular interesting types of packages of information like conscious agents, for example. The way that these concepts, bitterness, indignation, dissatisfaction, that contrary state of mind, would necessarily disrupt relationality between that conscious agent and the other. And given that relationality is not just a one-way street, it is a continuous flow of information going out and information coming in, I think undoubtedly what would be limited is outgoing information and ingoing information. If the quality of a relationship is built on the type of information, I think in certain situations the relationships certainly depend on volume of information, shared experiences, many conversations, intimate conversations, intimate experiences. If we were to suddenly place a block in the sense of a negative feeling in between this on this infrastructure, this highway for which the information passes, it's like having a car wreck. Of course, it's not going to be very efficient. The experiences, the prior experiences upon which that important relationship, the flower of the relationship bloomed on, is no longer able to hold it. It is suffocated, effectively. And I have to imagine that this relationship, just since we're speaking of the example that I experienced earlier today, I would have to imagine that this relationship would not be the only thing that suffers. I think internally there is also an expense. And here I don't necessarily think about this particular example because I didn't really feel envious or covetous in this situation. I was quite happy to see my friend had this nice possession, but there were other situations that I think involving the same person that I think about now as I've introduced this topic, that I think would be approaching something like this. If not covetousness, then it is an adverse feeling from somewhere for some reason that limits my expression. It limits my ability to connect and to build that relationship, to move closer. And I find it interesting, again, now that I reflect on it, that there are so many things that can lead to this disruption, covetousness being just one small piece of a much broader set of possibilities for which that infrastructure can be disrupted. And just a moment ago I mentioned that the relationship is not the only thing that would suffer. I think in my mind I have noticed a price. Now this may happen every so often. It's something that I would like to work on and to improve. And so I wonder if I could not take a moment to reflect on it and see if I can make heads or tails of exactly why it occurs in me. That there are times with the same individual, but also with any individual, that I may find my mind in such a state of arousal, in such a state of passivity, I think is a good word, a state of dejection, for which the will and the very producer, the heart of feelings, adding spice to life, is for some reason plagued by something. I think it's possible that it could be demonic. It's possible that it could be a self-limiting thing. That there is this man at the gate that wishes to keep at all times that city gate closed, to suffocate himself for whatever reason. A desire not to participate, a desire to stay quiet, perhaps to save another from negative emotion, or perhaps fear that negative emotion would emerge and ruin that experience of life, and rather the position of taking the observatory, the observer, the position of the observer, and the man of a quiet disposition wins out. And while I don't think in all cases that the man of the quiet disposition is in the wrong, but I do think that chronic passivity is destructive to the mind, because the mind lacks that ability to dynamically orient its attention and to continually engage for the purposes of connecting and building and of experiencing. A natural mode of the antagonist or antagonism to this, I have to imagine would be sinful. So that aside, I think it's related, but maybe not directly related, because it would involve other terms outside of just covetousness. But there is this, within the infrastructure analogy, the transmission of information remains the same. So I think this gets us a little bit closer to that principle of transgression. We know that this covetousness can affect the way in which information is transmitted. It affects it so that there is a suffocation, not only of the individual, but also of the relationships that the individual wishes to develop. But we still haven't found the principle that would help us identify when we have crossed the boundary. Now, covetousness, I think, is easier to comprehend when it is in the context of somebody else's spouse, for example, like lusting after somebody else's spouse. The thoughts and the feelings of sexual desire are quite obvious to my mind. And as soon as that happens, as soon as the mind wanders to a place that it ought not to, or the eyes move to a place on a woman that it ought not to be, and that is even passively the rumblings of some physical attraction, that is easy for me to identify. And the willful aspect of me can find that and stop it. And in this way, see, here I wonder about that relationship between this experience at that fundamental point at which the feeling begins to come about, for which there is a particular observation of somebody else's spouse that would lead me, lead anybody, to even the slightest inclination of sexual arousal. I'm wondering that relationship between that and covetousness. Now there is this longing and desire that is forming in the background. I would say even at this point, it has crossed the line. This is one of those other commandments that we are told not to break, we are advised to keep. But for purposes of this verse, the question is that point at which the thoughts betray the law? It's unquestionable that law in this case, in the case of lust after a spouse, that has crossed a boundary. But has it crossed over into covetousness? Here I struggle with the explicit thought and just the feeling. Because I do think that regardless of if it is a thought or if it is a feeling, the boundary has been crossed. The thought of wanting. Let me go back to the definition of our various roots of covet. The strong desire, the possessions of another. Now, what if it is just a strong desire? Well, if it is the possession of another, or a strong relation of another, then it doesn't really matter, I think, if the mind is focused on that relation. It is by virtue of that relationship, and not necessarily the explicit thought, that I think makes it a form of covetousness, although a mild form of it. And so I go back to the relatively benign example, and although I myself think that I did not experience this covetousness when I was talking to my friend, and I still believe that, I wonder at what point even the most subtle of thoughts would betray me and would lead me into that disposition. Would it be the daydream of owning that vehicle that my friend had bought? Would it be the reflection that I don't make enough money to afford such a vehicle? Would it be a particular judgment on my friend and of his working life in order just the time that he spends at work, the effort that his mind is put to, the thought of that, and of him just wanting material possessions for the sacrifice that he is giving his employer. Would that be a way to justify my way out of covetousness? And I don't think it is necessarily. I think there needs to be grace in these situations. If there is any, I think what is productive, perhaps, is that if the thought, the insecurity, builds, then I think what grace does best is that it cuts to the chase. If we may find grace, we may ask ourselves, do we desire this object? If we do, fine. There's plenty of things that can be desired. But if it is to be desired, it is not because we are jealous or we are envious. We desire it because there are inherently desirable qualities about it. We may participate with it. We may wish, because of its desirable qualities, to see what is inside the vehicle, perhaps. But most importantly, I think there ought to be a reflection on our friend in this situation. A giving of thanks to this person. A genuine thanks. Not a thanks, again, to subdue the thought of being covetous, but a genuine thanks in the sense that we are able to appreciate how such a possession would benefit or improve the condition of our friend. So where are we? I think I established to myself that not every situation is the same, and that while we may find one principle, there are various situations in which covetousness may find us. Some may be easier to see than others. But if we can stop it at the root, I think the better we are at curbing the potential negative consequences. But he that hates covetousness shall prolong his days. So the last thing that I want to talk about here is the prolonging of days. In the physical sense, I think we can find it somewhat reasonable that if we extend the severity of covetousness out long enough, we would find a precarious situation, in which that profound longing and desire for somebody else's possessions might lead to robbery, and because of that robbery it might lead to death, in which the person is shot or whatever. It might lead to the end of a relationship, end of all relationships for a person, lead to psychological despair. There are so many different avenues for which covetousness, I think, can affect one's experience. But I'm not too concerned about this physical sense. There's a concept that I think is important here. The concept of divine time as it's differentiated from linear and measurable time. That between kairos and that of chronos. Chronos being that linear, measurable time, and kairos being divine, appointed time, or in other words, purposeful time. And so when we say a day, it's possible that we can interpret this in terms, as I've just mentioned, that linear time, that life itself may be cut short because of the covetousness. But I think in a more meaningful way, more purposeful way, we should take that spiritual approach to time. And we find that spiritual approach to time quite well laid out in Genesis chapter 1, where each day follows a specific pattern, of God creating, of separating, of ordering, and then of declaring it good. Each day or each stage of creation has its purpose before moving on to the next. This applies as much to the management of things, of material things, as it does to the human experience, that of individual creation, individual growth, transformation. When we think about the fundamental elements of creation, separating light from darkness, making order from chaos, increasing this purposeful, directed conglomeration of information and of matter, separating the profane from the holy. Again, on the scale of that individual. When I think about his days, in this context, I don't think about the linear, measurable number of days that he lives, but rather his days are prolonged in the sense of creation, in the sense that his ability to change, to transform, to be better, is prolonged. And is prolonged because of that symbolic hatred towards covetousness. It is by that orientation that the individual is now able to see beyond those limiting desires of the heart, and be able to rise above it and transform. They will be able to themselves, on the part of that conscious agent, separate the light from the darkness. A man that does violence to the blood of any person shall flee to the pit. Let no man stay him. Now, much like in the last verse, as with time, I think the word blood is used in an interesting way here. There's a broader symbolic significance to it. I think if we were to speak about the body, or speak about some violence or injury done to somebody, we would speak of the body. A man that does violence to the body of any person shall flee to the pit. Now that's more of a physical interpretation. But even symbolically, I think that would have a slightly different meaning than a man that does violence to the blood of any person shall flee to the pit. And it's a bit of a strange thing to imagine violence being committed to blood, which in a physical sense is just that liquid material that carries oxygen, that carries nutrients. But I think the important point here is that when we are referring to blood, we are referring to its purpose, not its physical composition. And its purpose is, in some sense, to facilitate life. It can be seen, I suppose, in various contexts, some of which may not necessarily add up to a true physical analogy. But the flowing of blood can be seen in a way as the flowing of life through a person. And so, in a similar manner, a man that does violence to the life, to the essential portion of an individual, shall flee to the pit. Now, the pit is another interesting symbol. It is something that is introduced to us, I believe, in the Psalms, and it is a place quite similar to hell, if it is not the same thing. It is a place for both the dead and of the living. It is a place of darkness. It is a place of torment and absence. Again, similar to that last verse, since we're talking about creation, it is the place that would be the converse of the prolonging of days. It would be the cessation of days. And again, I want to move away from that purely physical analogy, that the cessation of days doesn't mean that the physical being is dead, because in this situation it's implied that a living person is going to the pit. So within the spiritual context, the insult that is given to the spirit, or as I mentioned before, the essential components of the individual, not essential in terms of physical, but essential in terms of those elements of mind that create the conscious entity, that cause it to be some unified thing. That the insult to that thing is, now this is a bizarre point, that the insult to that thing causes one to flee. And I have to wonder about that experience, but just to focus for the moment on the pit, it causes one to find themselves in that place, in that darkened environment. And the pit, quite simply, we imagine as a physical object, something that is quite deep, something that is dark at the bottom, something that is barely fit for our experience and our existence. We extend this into mind, that everything that the mind experiences is dark, dim, dull, meaningless. But this word flee, a strange word, I think, to be used. I think about a military context in which the retreating army is fleeing the onslaught of the to-be victorious army. And within the word flee, there is this inference of retreat and of running from. And I have to wonder why. Why is it the case that because somebody has murdered somebody else, likely, in this situation, why are they departing? Why are they retreating to the pit? And I'll have to say that I don't think that this is a willful thing. I think this is a consequence. Sometimes I find it difficult to separate spiritual meaning from material causality. But again, to reiterate, what has been done is that an aspect of creation has been destroyed. That what a person has participated in is the converse of creation. It is the taking of unity and the willful destruction of it. The purposeful, willful destruction of it. And I'll say that in some sense it's difficult to comprehend, because there are plenty of ways in which things in life itself, go from some central point of existence to a point that is multiplicitous. It degrades, it erodes. The fundamental building blocks are separated out and reformed into different organisms, objects, whatever. This is a part of life. And so what is it then about the willful, about the action of taking, of insulting the blood, that leads in this domain to the flight? And what exactly, if it is not the individual that flees, or if it is not that part of the self that is seemingly in control, like the part of myself that I believe is in control that is talking into this microphone. It seems like it's a natural consequence. But much like a broken army, if I was to be a part of a unit and the ranks were broken and we were routed, I would have to imagine that there's a part of that flight that is against, almost against will, in the sense that I fear so much for my life that I abandon everything and I just go without concern for the rational side of mind. Now, I don't think that this necessarily approaches the same type of thing. Or maybe it approaches it, but it's not one-to-one. Now, I've had experiences before, unfortunate experiences of my own doing, so maybe not unfortunate, but unfortunate that I had that I put forth the behavior, the desire, the attention to find myself in such a destitute place. I have struggled in my life with addiction. Thankfully, it has not gotten to the point where it's ruined my life or another person's life, but it has gotten to a point where it has affected my day-to-day. And as it stands now, I'm free of it for the most part. But the mind, the disposition that had got me there, still remains, and that's something that I continually have to work on. To continually give up and continually recognize that there is this part of me that can fall, and can fail. But in my deepest and the darkest moments for which I found myself in that pit, the flight to that was almost as if something else took over me, the force that was beyond my control. That it was a hand that I certainly played a willful part in accepting, but once I took that hand, it pulled me into it. And once I was into it, my mind was given to absence, to that complete darkness. And it would have done anything that the hand that was offered desired. The movement from wherever that introductory place was, wherever the hand was offered, perhaps a place of insecurity, a place of fatigue. Once, again, that hand was accepted, flight took place. It was the flight away from life, away from the blood. And as a parallel, I have to imagine that the process of taking the blood propels the mind into a state of darkness. Or at least affords the possibility of propelling the mind into a state of darkness. A man that does violence to the blood of any person shall flee to the pit. Let no man stay him. An expression that I'm unfamiliar with, let no man stay him. I would imagine that it would mean that it would refer to staying in the presence of him for an extended period, of allowing him to be in our presence, of us being willfully in his presence, because that experience in the spiritual domain has an effect. And as we are highly emotional and reflective creatures, I think that what is shown to us through the face of another can feed into us. That information that is offered by them, however subtle it might be, can find its way into our hearts, and that is dangerous. So let no man stay him. Whoso walks uprightly shall be saved, but he that is perverse in his ways shall fall at once. So this is a typical motif that we see in the Proverbs. An opportunity to think of what of walking upright must be, what being saved is. And as I think about myself, as I think about my individual experience, as all of us ought to when we are reflecting on the Proverbs, and how to be better, how to be upright, there's always a way, I think, to find that point of being saved, to experience a microcosm of it so we can understand the broader pattern, how it may unfold in the broader scale of our lifespan, or even broader in the sense of a nation being saved, or a family being saved, whatever, a relationship being saved. Whoso walks uprightly shall be saved. So what does it mean to walk upright? We use the physical analogy of posture. Being upright is a position of attention. It's a posture that is ready for mobility. It is a posture that is functional. It is meant to be. It is the place that we have grown into, that we have evolved to. The upright posture. But of course, as with many things, the physical analogy gets us here. We are at a place of attention, a place to do, to act, to recognize purpose, to find purpose, to produce, to give, to receive. We extend this out beyond the physical, for it would not necessarily make sense of an immoral person that they are constantly, always physically hunched over and decrepit. There are plenty of people that walk physically upright, but are not upright in their character or in their ethics. The sense of uprightness is a term that extends into many different dimensions. And when I consider these dimensions, I consider one in particular about my experience that I've been thinking lately. Outside of a state of reflection or a meditative state, we find ourselves in the day-to-day. We find ourselves involved and engaged in many different conversations, many different interactions with people, some of which we are unable to do justice to, some of which we satisfy quite well. Among those that I find I'm unable to do justice to, I know when it happens. I know that it happens because I'm paying attention. Now, I can't say that just because I'm paying attention, I'm able to correct the situation. But at least there's the awareness. Now, the awareness in and of itself, I don't think, is purely uprightness. I think awareness with action, with intention, is more of on the path that we would consider to be upright. The upright person not only attends, but also executes on what they deem to be right or deem to be good. Now, there are plenty of ways in which one can deem something to be good, but in fact, it is not. It may be counterproductive. But given that we must believe that there is some unification that transcends all of this multiplicity, and that there is, despite the multiplicity, despite the cycles, a thread that unites all of it, I think we must also be aware then that we cannot give in to that arbitrary sense of things, the randomness of what one considers to be good. It is not to be considered some projection or some hallucination of goodness, but in fact that there is goodness. And although goodness may be contextual and difficult to see, depending on the circumstance, it is there to be found. It is there to be felt, and it is there to be experienced. But of the upright person, I have a feeling when I think about my own experiences, even when I think about a conversation that I had today. I think about the ways in which I failed to stand up to what I know that I could be, to the standard that I could be. But I fell short of it. And I knew at the moment that that upright person is there. The faith, the understanding that truth, that goodness is there. But for whatever reason, the process for which I should have embarked to solve the issue was left by the wayside. And I have to wonder why I do this at times. That sometimes situations that may be relatively straightforward but require a degree of nuance, I shy away from, perhaps because I think it may take too long, or I may feel like I'm being judged from somebody, so I try to hurry things along so that I could satisfy the general sense of urgency. But I believe what we sacrifice in terms of expediency for expediency is the process by which we deliberate. We sacrifice our judiciousness. And being saved from a difficult situation, being saved physically, what we are being saved from is some insult to experience. We are being saved from falsehood. We are being saved from the pit. We are being saved from self-deception, or deception in general. We are being saved from a conceited heart that would otherwise wish to make poor sacrifices for the sake of the elevation of self, the elevation of the ego. But he that is perverse in his ways shall fall at once. Now, the definition of perverse, of a person or their actions showing a deliberate and obstinate desire to behave in a way that is unreasonable or unacceptable, often in spite of the consequences. And I find interesting some of the similar words being awkward, contrary, difficult, unreasonable, uncooperative, unhelpful. How many places this can extend to? how many situations, if I just had a second to calm the mind, to take a deep breath, and to imagine, to consider, to reflect, how many experiences of this falling, the sense of how exactly can I describe it? This is certainly of an individual sort. I don't know if this is shared or if this is common, but there's a way in which the feeling of this fall or this failure emotionally, it almost feels like a physical fall. The emotions begin to bubble up and distort reason. It is something, perhaps, that even if it's not necessarily an emotion, it is poor value placed in some purpose. Like, again, the misplaced elevation of the self, and of the way in which another may view the self. That it creates these barriers that would otherwise limit our ability to walk our way through problems, and to be productive, to be kind, to be good, to find the truth in things. He that tills his land shall have plenty of bread, but he that follows after vain persons shall have poverty enough. Another verse that is commonly repeated throughout the Proverbs. Now, although I don't till land, I participate in the new society, in the technological society. I live in a metropolitan area. I live in an area that is very densely populated. There is a large division of labor that takes place here. And regardless of where we are professionally, we all participate in this machine, in this system, this technological construction. We all till our land to some degree, to some equivalence. And I find that the land that I till, the purpose that I pursue, the problems that I solve in my working life, in my personal life, are filled with these opportunities. Any time that is free or open, that I'm not doing something, there is this opportunity to till the land, to work, to harvest, to plant, always moving forward. Now, it may not necessarily be one particular job, let's say, because there are certainly ways in which we can overwork ourselves, that we can lose sight of something that is actually important and valuable for something that is a vain pursuit. But as the verse suggests, with bread is always something that is needed for survival. It is never really going to be something that is in vain, let's say, unless there is plenty of bread. But imagining a farmer in the age that this was produced, the type of luxury that we are accustomed to, and the manufacture, the level of industry that has been achieved in the modern world would be a bit foreign. And so I think the relationship to tillage and the importance, the discipline that is required, and the regular discipline, the regular maintenance of those pursuits would make bread, would make the product of such a way, of such a position and economic standing that plenty probably would not be likely. And if there was extra, it would be for insurance purposes. It would be just in case something bad were to happen. Maybe there's some poor harvest, and so there's extra from the harvest prior, or whatever the preserves would allow for. In this type of environment, in this context, if we are to draw this parallel even farther, we say that among modern man's luxuries, among his industry, the principle here does not go away. For whatever he gains in material prosperity, he must be as equally diligent to preserve his spiritual well-being, in the sense that before his industriousness, he was tasked at being prudent to maintain his survival. After his industriousness, he may afford himself life by cheap food, but he may not afford himself value of the soul for the work that he does. And while in the old world there may be some of this division of labor, such that there were people that hung around and did very little, or hung around and had types of jobs, positions that were not directly involved with the procurement of food, like many of us today. Likely what would have happened was some sort of engagement with a vicious party, a party that would go around and take rather than produce. And while in the ancient context I think this probably would have been a bit more straightforward, a bit more direct, may have involved outright violence, something that we would be quite unaccustomed to in our way of life. But there's a way in which it has not changed. There's a way in which I think it has become even more insidious. And that instead of this explicitness, what we find of people that take, we find people participating in this large machine, this technological machine, the modern society. And it is not even clear to the people that participate in it whether or not their participation is a robbery, or if it is that just tillage and the production of something that they actually deserve. And I wonder this, not in too much of a judgmental way about others, although it's impossible not really to think about all of the situations, but of my position. I try my best to do and to be of service, but I wonder in the broader scheme of it, in the machine that reimburses value, if the very machine that one participates in is actually corrupt, full of greed to such a point that the distribution of value is incongruent, and that while at once we may have been tempered by the necessity of being disciplined and of tilling, and those that were obnoxious and perverse were obvious in their behaviors and their actions. Now even to our own participation with these layers of institutions and of economic controls, I wonder at it all. I wonder at my place and many of our places in this thing, and of the bread that we produce for ourselves and for our being, for our spiritual nourishment. But he that follows after vain persons shall have poverty enough. Vain persons, I think we can extend this into a vanity of transpersonal agents as well, since we are, again, in an era of quite large corporate bodies, institutions. And this poverty, while it may not find itself in the form of a rumbling stomach, although it may, it is likely to find itself in a mind that is void of proper emotion, of connection, of purpose. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. I'll continue next time with verse 20 of chapter 28.